Now that Jedd Fisch is on the ground here in Seattle, he's got a tough challenge ahead of him.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. We write for Inside the Huskies of Fan Nation Sports Illustrated. You can check out all our written work over there at si.com/college/Washington. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, Lars, speaking of getting started, let's jump right into it here. So Jedd Fisch, it's official. You and I, as the everydayers are listening to this on Tuesday, we will be on our way to his introductory press conference. So let's talk about his first big challenge. And that's very simple. It's filling out the roster, where we've seen a lot of guys enter the transfer portal. Some of them still could come back. That's very possible. But we've seen a lot of guys out of the transfer portal. We're probably going to see something similar at Arizona. The first, as we record this on Monday afternoon, we've only seen one member of the Wildcats roster hit the portal so far, and that's running back Jonah Coleman, who is expected to follow Fisch up here to Washington. So that'll be an interesting get. We'll talk about more of that about it when and if it does become official. But until then, let's talk about what this roster might need, because right now there are two positions that I think are going to be very important going forward. And that's both lines. That's the offensive line. That's the defensive line.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things, because obviously when you look at Jedd Fisch and you look at Arizona and you just think, okay, who do we want? T-Mac, McMillan, and Noah Fifita, right? The quarterback, quarterback receiver. But in order for those guys to succeed, similar to Michael Penix and the trio of receivers at Washington, you need a Hoss up front. And you need a couple of Hosses up front. As we discussed on the other show a couple of days ago, you got your center taken care of. That's fine. Center inside out's good. Now you just got to replace everybody else, because Nate Calippo transferred. Julius Buelo, I think, is the only starter who technically has not hit the portal that does have eligibility left. Everybody else is gone. So
outside of Parker Brailsford, of course, but yeah, you mentioned him. So
right, exactly. And so with that being said, I would not be surprised if UW takes at least two offensive linemen from Arizona. Could be three, maybe even more, right? Depending on if you're taking. I mean, because they just got a transfer from Northwestern who didn't play at all as a freshman, but is from the state of Arizona. So part of me thinks, okay, well, they might even take some of those guys, just knowing, okay, long term, this is maybe who we want to keep and
sure,
coach up and develop. Because as we've seen, the portal works two ways: instant impact, right? Like a Jonah Coleman, like a Noah Fifita, Will Rogers,
Tetairoa McMillan, yeah, those kinds of guys.
Right, and then you also want to have the guys like not necessarily a Will Nixon, but maybe a Jeremy Bernard, where it's like, hey, we're going to bring you in, we're going to develop you, and especially when you come to offensive linemen, you're not going to play as a freshman or maybe even a redshirt freshman unless you're really, really good like Parker Brailsford. So getting some extra bodies in the offensive line room will be key, especially knowing, probably some other guys might retire, or, when Jedd Fisch really gets a hold of the roster and really goes through with Matt Doherty, his director of player personnel, who is also coming with him to Washington, unsurprisingly.
Right.
That you're basically Matt Doherty is the GM role that Courtney Morgan had / director of recruiting, all that stuff. Just for clarification of people. Obviously, I know but for the listeners out there that don't know who these names
are.
Hey,
I'm just being your hype man back here. Like, yeah, all right.
Right. I was like, yeah, just be clear. Let me clarify this real quick. But once those guys get a hold of the roster and actually see what they're dealing with, then you're going to start to see some of those younger portal additions. Some maybe sophomores, redshirt freshmen, where, hey, we're going to bring these guys in and develop them. They probably won't play this year or next year, but these are going to be kind of foundational pieces on top of the impact players. So I think I'd give them introductions today on Tuesday. Got to think by Friday they have a better sense of the roster.
Sure.
Because it's not going to be a super long wait, but again, you're not just going to, this isn't Madden where you just, or NCAA 14 where you just, okay, we go overall high to low. We're just going to get rid of the 20 lowest, 60 overall guys. No, that's not how this world works. Unfortunately, I know it seems like it, but it's not. But I do think that there's enough pieces from Arizona that they're going to bring. But the other thing with this staff, once Jedd Fisch puts it together, can you get other guys in the portal, not just Arizona guys, right? I think that's going to be the key for me with Jedd Fisch.
So you bring up a great point there, because that's where I wanted to go with this, where the first thing that we can talk about is a couple guys in the transfer portal that we believe could pull their names out and stick around in Seattle. And I think the two biggest names that you want to talk about in that sense are quarterback Austin Mack and wide receiver German Bernard, who entered on Monday, where you can talk about guys like that, whereas those are probably the two biggest needs. And that's no offense to a guy like a Nate Kalepo, where he was a starter for the last couple of years along this offensive line, or even a Jabbar Muhammad, where it seems like he is exploring other options, where he would be a great guy to get back. I think he'll end up at Texas, wants to go be closer to his family. So we'll see how a couple of those other ones play out, right? And then you can look at other guys like Mish Powell, for example, Asa Turner, where if you can get a couple of those guys back out of the portal, hey, maybe they like what Jedd Fisch had to say in his opening remarks to the team. Maybe they see what he was building. They look at some film and say, okay, yeah, I feel like I might be able to thrive in that. That would be really big. And of course, there's going to be another portal window that opens up after spring football, where we're probably going to see some more acquisitions around that time period, where the coaching staff, when it is fully put together, can have a better sense of the roster and say, okay, we still need a couple of big defensive tackles. Maybe we still need an extra offensive lineman. Whatever those extra needs might be, there's still going to be a lot of time to address it. I'm just very curious how he's going to go about it, because let's talk about that staff for a second, where Brendan Carroll is coming, offensive line and offensive coordinator. That's a huge get. The running backs coach, that's another one. It looks like the majority of the offensive staff from Arizona, which did a fantastic job down there. We're going to get more into why we're really excited about what this staff could possibly be. And then it's just going to be a matter of filling out the defense. We'll kind of see what that looks like. With what kind of defensive staff he was able to put together at Arizona, I have high hopes and I have high expectations, because Fisch showed that he could put together a good defensive staff that turned into a really solid defense. Look what they did in the Alamo Bowl. They recorded 6 turnovers in that game against Oklahoma. So there's a lot to like. There's a lot of promising things there. And now it's just a matter of, you can get the personnel in place from a staff standpoint, but then how is it going to translate on the field? Are you going to be able to use whatever bigger budget you're going to be getting from Washington and translate that into maybe getting guys like Noah Carter and Keona Wilhite back, doing that, or maybe, just putting all your resources into 2025 and saying, we'll get some stopgap options in the transfer portal right now, and then we're going to make sure we hit really, really hard along this class of 2025.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, given the way that the 25 class was sizing up for Washington under DeBoer, I think that probably is actually the route they'll go, because you want to get the impact guys out of the portal, but then build the rest of it. It's kind of earmark them like, hey, let's go after, the Dijon Lees. Let's still make sure we can get those guys, because if they already have interest in Washington, I mean, this isn't a slight to the last defensive staff, but I don't think Chuck Moreau was going to be the reason that Dijon Lee or Juice Brown is going to be the reason that Dijon Lee came to Washington, right? Now, you can say, like, Phillip Bell, all the receivers, Jamarcus Shepard, that's a pretty easy reason to see why. So I think there's kind of an open canvas on defense for Fisch if he can get the right hire. And I don't want to speculate, obviously, but man, if he can in some way get Brendan's father involved in this defensive staff, like, that is a lot of cachet to where, hey, if you can just set up the defense, we'll get some recruiters around you. Almost in a way like a Saban, where it's like, hey, you're the architect of the defense. This is kind of your defense, but you're older now, so you don't want to be as hands-on. Right. So we're going to get some extra bodies around you. I think that's almost a perfect scenario. I don't think it'll happen, just because that's not far-fetched, but it's out there. Sure. It's out there. It's out there. It's not totally impossible. But my point in saying that is there's a lot of potential on the staff, and also the defense at Washington historically has been pretty good. So aside from the last two coaching staffs that kind of took a back seat to it for different reasons, now you can kind of retool that and say, hey, let's start. And I think the one thing that is, to your point about the 25 class, go get Xavier Sale.
Find a way to get him back in the boat.
And it's because it sounds like, from initial impressions, he's really going to hit the state hard. So I think that would kind of be a good, especially in this class. There's no perfect class. There's no better class to do that with than the 25 class in the state of Washington.
I completely agree with you there. So Let's talk about some of the concerns that some fans might have surrounding Jedd Fisch. Right after we send a message to our friends over at Jace Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but can we talk just for a minute about preparing for real life? According to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. This is scary. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if any of my family or friends got sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication they needed. Thankfully, we'll be okay because of Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial infections because this stuff could happen to any of us. Visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jacemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. So, Lars, we did a really fun live show right after Jedd Fisch got hired, and we talked about how we were really excited about this hire. We think that he could do a really good job building this program, and we got a lot of feedback from the everydayers, which is awesome. We really do appreciate all of that. But 2 of the top things that we saw was that he's not going to be around long term, and that he has a 16-21 record in his career at Arizona. Let's start with the latter one there first. When Jedd Fisch got to Arizona in 2021, that was a 1-win team. That was not a good program. That was just a disaster. And so what does he do in his first year there? He goes out and he gets Tetairoa McMillan, and he does a really good job recruiting. Now, there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered. It's okay, well, now he's got to level up. Now he's in the Big Ten. He's going to have to compete against some bigger powers to recruit, but can he do that consistently? I think that, we might be pleasantly surprised by that fact. But I don't think when you look at his record and you just look at even his track record, we'll get to more of that too, that there's anything to really be concerned about on that front when you talk about his coaching record.
Exactly. And I think you also have to consider what he inherited at Arizona, to your point, where it's like he took over from Kevin Sumlin, who literally drove that program into the ground, in impressive fashion. So the fact that he was able to recruit a player of the caliber of McMillan, where whatever we'll get to that. We're going to get that. We've been working on some of the other offensive lineman names, and we're still working on some of those as well. But getting McMillan with coming off the season that they were, that's a pretty big statement. And when you factor in, it wasn't like they had Washington's NIL infrastructure in place, right? They obviously have some NIL down there, but nowhere near what Washington can possess, right? So he's doing it's almost in a way what people would say about DeBoer, where he's winning with lesser talent. He's doing this with lesser resources. So give him more resources, see what happens. We saw what happened with DeBoer, right? And I think Jedd Fisch is a better recruiter than DeBoer, so he's going to maximize that more than what we saw at Washington, more so out of high school ranks than out of the portal. Because I think they're always going to be able to get portal guys, right? Like when you're a winning established program, even if you're getting them from Oklahoma State or Kansas State or Texas Tech or whatever, you're still getting established Power 5 players to come to your program on a 1-year, 2-year basis to win championships. That shows that it's the hallmark of a good program. The other hallmark is making sure you're rotating in 4- and 5-star players, right? A lot of Jedd Fisch's guys at Arizona were 3 stars, but high 3 stars. These guys probably could be a little bit better if they were in a different situation. So now that you're at Washington, you have access to 4 stars and potentially 5 stars.
Right.
When combined with the recruiting prowess that Jedd has and the offensive mind that he is, I don't see why he couldn't get a decent amount of 4 stars and maybe a couple of 5 stars at the end of the day.
So I completely agree with you there. And I think that's a great point to just kind of lead into the other conversation about this is, all right, well, he stops 2 years here, 2 years here, 2 years there, and hasn't really planted his flag anywhere to build a legacy. So the contract that he signed, we reported a number yesterday that we had seen. And so we said, we'll probably have to run with this for now and we can amend things later. So Bruce Feldman and others reported that he got a $7.75 million deal over 7 years. That's going to be attached with a hefty buyout when you look at those numbers. We don't have the exact framework of that, but it's probably a very high buyout. So if somebody wants to come in and poach him, like let's say Florida, his alma mater, which is what a lot of people have been speculating about, that's going to be a really hefty price tag to get him out of there. And that leaves Washington with a whole lot of extra funds to go honestly do whatever they want. But I don't think that that's something we're going to have to worry about. And I know we said the same thing about Kalen DeBoer, but it's because there wasn't a contract like this in place where this kinds of wards off a lot of people that might say, oh yeah, that's going to be the guy because look at that deal. Whereas with Kalen not signing that contract, it was, even though, you and I both expected that deal to get done for a while, that it was still like, oh yeah, he's gettable if you want him. This kind of takes him out of that range and kind of stacks him up with what Dan Lanning's contract down at Oregon is, in a sense.
Right, exactly. And I think that's also the other thing, too, when you consider it's a 7-year contract. Most schools wouldn't probably go beyond 5. I don't think Arizona was going to go beyond 5. So, now again, nobody expects Jedd Fisch to stay for 7 years. But if you can get 5, that's fine, right? I think, because again, if he does have the success that we both think he does at Washington, the NFL is going to be attractive to him, right? And vice versa.
Yeah.
Right? So at that point, if you've been here for 3 or 4 years, okay, we can accept, hey, you won a Big Ten title or you got to a Big Ten championship or, as long as you're progressing enough. Because the other side of that coin is if he doesn't, then it doesn't matter because the other schools aren't going to want him or,
Sure.
won't be as attractive. So it's a perfect situation for Washington to where I would imagine that buyout's probably 15 to 20 or maybe even higher and then decreasing as the years go along. Like put the buyout at 30 million first year, 25 second year, 20 third year, 15, 10,
and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Work it down because the longer the contract, the longer you stay, the less a buyout is. Just naturally, that's how contracts work. So it's really to prevent Jedd in the first 2 or 3 years of that deal. So if Florida wants to fire Billy Napier next year or the year after that, then that's another $125 million move for an SEC school, which if they want to do it, that's fine. But if you're Washington, you want to be able to prevent that as much as possible. Whereas Kalen dropping $12 million was nothing for Alabama. That's less than I believe Saban's making. So or maybe it's around Saban's contract. So Alabama, that was never going to be an issue for them. But with other schools like Florida, Missouri, whichever ones you want to see, those are the ones that you need to prevent. And so that's why having, I would say, 30 does seem a little steep. So I can see 20, 25. But if it's anything under, if it's under 15, I'll be surprised. Just because it's
I agree.
Like why? Why are you going to get a guy that has not stayed more than 2 or 3 years at a school or at really any place, not even a school, just in general in any job, which is fine because he's been working his way up. Now you get the Arizona job for 3 years. Okay. Now you get the Washington job for 5 years. Then you can go to the NFL with the Patriots or whatever, do whatever you want to do. But if he's leaving 2 years from now, that's a problem. So that's why you have those buyouts in place and significant buyouts to ward off, at least filter through some of the other options he could have.
And so just kind of back to that original point too, of not staying in one place for very long. He wasn't a head coach at a lot of those places.
Exactly.
So like you exactly just said, he's working his way up through the ranks to be able to get to a position like this. And who knows, maybe after a year or two here, he says, you know what, the NFL, yeah, that's fine. Maybe I'll consider that down the line, but I'm winning here. I'm doing a good job here. And of course, there are a lot of factors between now and then. But assuming, let's just talk from the standpoint of things going well. Maybe he says, okay, yeah, this is a little bit, I enjoy this aspect of it. I enjoy living up here. I don't really want to move my family. All those kinds of things can come into play. And maybe he sticks around long-term. And there are just a lot of factors at play here where maybe, and it just all goes back to the deal being a good one and a very smart move on the part of athletic director Troy Dannon, where he says, okay, yeah, I lost Kalen DeBoer. This all happened. It went the way that it did. I need to make a rebound really quickly. So he goes out and gives a significant deal to a good head coach. The track record, you can say whatever you will about it. Go back and look at the last 2 years of Arizona and how he built that program up through getting a fantastic staff on board. And that's another really promising thing about getting him up here is he did a really good job at not only developing and putting a really great offensive staff around him that scored a lot of points, did a really good job, but the defensive staff was tremendous. And they did a fantastic job. Go watch the film of the game against Washington last year. They did a really good job of finding ways to limit Michael Penix. And yeah, Mike still got his yards and he still did a really great job in that game. but that staff was fantastic at finding ways to limit explosive plays, which is something that we've seen around Washington for a very long time under Pete Kwiatkowski, where that's a really nice aspect of it. And that defensive line that they have is really fast. It's really physical. And I think with added resources could continue to add top tier bodies along there as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing that we didn't see from DeBoer was as good of a defense. And so the fact that Jedd was able to build a better staff with guys that necessarily weren't his guys, that's what's promising to me, is he's not going after, I've had this guy for 10 years. I've had this, which I understand coaches love continuity, but after a while it's like, okay, how are you going to take these guys to all these different places? It's like, can you win with anybody else? Can you have relationships with anybody else? Or is it literally just your core guys? Because we've seen, USC, X, Y, and Z, number of schools. Oh, well, this is like the old boys club and it's falling apart because, again, you need to expand that reach. You need to grow your tree. And I think Jedd, as a relationship guy, will do that without question.
I completely agree with you there. So let's shift gears here a little bit, because we were expecting Washington to compete right away in the Big Ten. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on the roster, but how quickly can they compete under Jedd Fisch? Right after a message from our friends over at FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use, and there's so many different ways to bet, like live same game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub. The best way to find popular parlays and more, so visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. And hey, that Lions bet that we talked about a couple weeks ago, that looked pretty good. They got that win over the Rams, and I'd keep my eye on them. Some Super Bowl odds where you can. Highly recommend. All right, Lars. Oh, please go ahead.
Real quick off the FanDuel line, because we'll love this. Yeah. Washington was plus 8,000 before the Jedd Fisch hire to win the national championship in 25. They are now plus 7,000.
Interesting.
Better odds than Utah, Auburn, Louisville, Florida. Arizona's now plus 1,700, so that should tell you a lot.
Yeah.
That should tell you a lot. But yeah, they're right in that ballpark. Trying to think. Kansas State's 6, Miami's 6, USC's 4. So they're right there. Like they're to lead into our segment of how quickly can they compete.
Yep. No, hey, you know what you're doing with the segues. You're a professional. Exactly. So let's talk about that, because after Kalen DeBoer left, it was, oh no, all these guys are going to go with him. We're going to see what this looks like. And now, of course, there's still a lot of things that we just discussed on this episode about what he needs to do first before we can really have this discussion, but we're going to have it anyways, because this is a podcast and this is what we do. So let's talk about that, because you and I went through the schedule for the 2024 season, and depending on, a few things here, a few things there, 8-4, 9-3 is very possible. And especially after what Kalen DeBoer just showed is possible at Washington, you think that I would say that 8-4 would be, because like you said before the show, just the absolute floor of what this team could be in 2024.
Right. And again, that's not factoring in injuries, but just kind of generally what I would expect. As you said, we ran through the schedule, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, might be a close win. I could see that going maybe one or two ways. But then now I said, let's revisit that at the end of March when we have a better idea of who the roster is and what some other programs look like. Because we also know that there's going to be massive additions and subtractions at other schools, right? Especially in the Big Ten, where we saw Julian Fleming go from Ohio State to Penn State. So now that Penn State game looks a lot more challenging, but maybe facing Ohio State in the future doesn't. So there's always going to be kind of a give and take with this. But yeah, if Washington loses more than 4 games next year, I will be really surprised, just because there's too much talent on this roster. There's too much ability in this region and this kind of program to where this is not a slight at Kalen DeBoer. But if Kalen DeBoer can take that roster in 22 and get 10 wins out of it in the regular season, plus an Alamo Bowl win and get to 11, there's certainly a 9-win chance in this team. Like, you don't have a Michael Penix, right? But we saw how good Noah Fifita can be. Yeah. And also worth noting, Will Rogers was at the team meeting. So if Will Rogers and Noah Fifita play, because then you got Will Rogers on a 1 year, Noah Fifita for 2 or 3, Will Rogers also got hurt last season, so I can see both of those guys accepting that role and being like, hey, whichever one wins, we might not play, or if I do, then Noah Fifita plays for 2 years or a year at Washington. That's fine. And so it's
I want to talk about that Noah Fifita angle of this for a second, because obviously nothing is set in stone there. As we're recording this, he hasn't put his name in the transfer portal just yet. So we just want to make sure we add that caveat in there, where I don't necessarily, and that's something I'm really curious about. Like, let's say Will Rogers does decide to withdraw his name from the portal and stay at Washington. I'm a little curious on if Noah Fifita would follow him and just say, yeah, I'm willing to, after starting for the back half of the season and doing really, really well, really, truly being incredibly impressive. I don't know if he's going to want to say, I'm going to take a step back this year and sit around and then compete for a job again in 2025. I'm a little curious about that angle of it all, but to what you just said, to your point there, I think that either way, that this roster will be totally fine, because we still, the Jamarcus Shepard angle of this has not been announced yet, again, as we record this, where he could come back to Washington as the wide receivers coach. If he does that, I would expect that Jeremy Bernard would probably end up staying around, and then, we'll see what happens with Tetairoa McMillan. And then you can look at that top four of Jeremiah Hunter, Tetairoa McMillan, Jeremy Bernard, Denzel Boston. You throw in Giles Jackson where you can. That's still a really, really good group of wide receivers, where if you can figure out the offensive line, and now we talked about it early on with Jonah Coleman and Cameron Davis, where right there, that's a fantastic group of skill players, and this offense can compete right away.
And then you just have to kind of figure out the offensive line angle, because now Roger Rosengard declared, Troy Fatano declared, Nate Kalepo's in the portal. So Buelo and Parker Rosengard. When you look at Arizona's roster, you got Wendell Moe, you got Jonah Siava, and then there's a few others that are kind of options, right? Maybe reserve options, redshirt freshmen, redshirt sophomores that could be, maybe weren't starters or they played this year, that could kind of work their way up. If you can solidify the offensive line, because I do think, again, Gardner Millar could be fantastic.
I was going to say that's going to be the guy where I'm like, I still think he could be a really big contributor on this team.
But I do think, to your point, or to that point, you do want to also have bodies in the room just in case. Before we started recording, I mentioned that about Kirby Smart. Kirby and Saban and all those guys understand, just get him in the building. Figure it out later. If they transfer a year or two from now, so be it. Just get them in the building, because if anything, you'd rather be in the season or in March or going into August. Oh, okay, well, we got, maybe his rehab is taking a little longer, or maybe he had a setback. And then instead of be like, well, now we got to go to a walk-on or a true freshman or a redshirt freshman. Now we're like, hey, we got a junior that can transferred in, that can just be like, hey, you know what? Ease your way back in. We still want you. We still could be totally fantastic, but don't feel the need to push back so quickly.
So I'm with you there. And then, so let's flip sides of the ball here, because we need to talk about the defense, where we know one person who already basically announced that he's going to be staying is former four-star recruit, Caleb Presley, cornerback, where that's the group that I'm really curious about personally, where I think that they'll do a good job of figuring out the defensive line, the front seven, with, maybe a couple of guys from Arizona, maybe a couple other guys from the portal, just after the spring period. But I'm really curious to see what the back end looks like, where and we have to talk about it right now in the sense of there's no Michelle Powell, there's no Jabbar Muhammad. Whereas, okay, some of these young, and Javion Green announced that he's going to be going to Stanford, where, all right, now it's on some of these redshirt freshmen to step up, which is something I was really curious about even before Kalen DeBoer left, where it's, all right, who's going to make a jump? Is it going to be Caleb Presley? Is it going to be Leroy Bryant? Is it going to be Curly Reed? Where we saw Leroy Bryant was kind of starting to show what he had towards the end of the year, where Jeremy Bernard wasn't returning punts at the national championship. And one of the guys in warmups back there was Leroy Bryant. I know, Lars, you're very high on him and his athleticism. You think he's going to be a real stud. I'm really big on Curly Reed. I think that his frame, his length, and everything he can do just in man coverage is going to be huge. And I think it could be a really big, important part of whatever Washington's defense is going to look like moving forward. So the question is, if you can figure out just the back end of the defense and get it back to where it was in, let's just say 2021, because it was elite in 2021. And obviously that's a very different story when you're talking about Trent McDuffie, Kyler Gordon, Buki, just all those guys, that's a very different defense. But if you can get it back to just what it used to be, then this is just, it not only justifies the hire of Jedd Fisch and everything he's able to do with building a staff, but it gets Washington back to a contender on both sides of the ball. It's not just an elite offense and then the defense shows up in spots. It's, oh no, this is a really solid defense that makes a lot of plays and is really just a shutdown defense, because Arizona's run defense was in the top 20 nationally. So that's really big. And then you can figure out the back end from there.
I was gonna say, give me Gunnar Maldonado at safety. Like that's the guy for me.
Yeah,
that's because again, you're thinking about it where it's like you again almost similar to with the offensive line, where you want to get some impact players, but then you want those younger, maybe redshirt freshmen, redshirt sophomores that you can kind of bring along, knowing that okay, maybe some of these guys will take the place of a 25 guy, but we have experience with him, so we can trust them more and know what they can bring. But yeah, I mean, there's so many pieces on this Arizona defense. My word, I mean, just take a look. Like
that's a good team.
I mean, Jedd Fisch did not get it. I know it's easier said than easier to say now, but like Jedd Fisch did not get the credit he deserved in Arizona. I mean, I know he got credit, right? But like that was probably one of the more unsung. Had Kalen DeBoer not done what he done, and Mike Norvell didn't do what he did, you got a pretty good case for Coach of the Year, or at least and he was the finalist for Coach of the Year. So there's a lot to like about Jedd Fisch, not just on the offensive side of the ball, which I think, again, I cannot stress that enough. Kalen was a Grand Slam Super Bowl hire as an offensive guy. So is Jedd Fisch. But one of the two understands defense a little bit more, and I think that's what's going to separate Jedd Fisch.
So I think that's a great place to wrap this up too, because I'm in total agreement with you there. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We've got so much fun new content coming for you, because now that there's a new coach, we're going to have to talk about that in so many different ways. So make sure you keep it right here on Locked On Huskies and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We are there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you like the video. Leave us a comment down below if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. If you're an audio-only listener, make sure you leave us a 5-star review. That all really helps this channel out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Wednesday.